Yo guys, what is up? Max in our build video for Wolong, and today we're going over my Poison Lightning God build. Now, this build, it shines in New Game Plus. I originally was playing on my Flame Hashira build, and then I hit some of the hardest bosses in New Game Plus, like Labu, and after struggling on my old builds, I swapped to this build and did it in 4 tries. This build shines against the tougher enemies, and we're focusing on constantly keeping everything that we fight against status effect and getting free critical blows. I'm going to have a little gameplay demonstration, and then we're going to get into the actual build. Before we get into the build video, I just want to show you guys a quick demonstration of how this build works. This is a status effect damage over time build meant to build up as much spirit on enemies as possible and make your life super easy with getting easy critical strikes or fatal blows on enemies. So real quick, we're just gonna pop our buffs. So I'm gonna hit him with a poison or 2, pop our elemental weapon, and hit him twice or 2. Now he's got poison on him, he's got lightning on him, and those status effects will increase his spirit bar without me even hitting him. So when he is now taking those, I'm going to pop my perfect restoral so that if I do get hit, I can't actually take any damage. Looks like he's going to go for this. I'm just going to tap him once, free critical strike. And that's kind of the concept of the build. This was designed, once again, for the toughest enemies in New Game Plus. He's got more poison on him. We can pop our restoral again so that we can't get hit. And once again, he is just going to take a ton of spirit damage without me even having to hit him. Let's block that real quick. Throw our poison on him, pop our weapon, and then hit him again. And yeah, it's basically just a damage over time status effect build. My controller just died, so that's a little awkward, but you get the point. Spirit bar go up for free. We don't really have to do much. It's super nice. So for the format of this video, we're going to do gear first, then spells, then beast, and then my stats. And to start us off, we're using the Strategist of Genius set. Now, this is something I was trying to achieve on my fire build. I saw how strong the damage to enemies with status effects were, and my goal on my fire build was to light enemies on fire and then hit them really hard because we had all this damage against enemies that were suffering from status effects. Now, this set is that times a bunch. It is just so much better because this set is all focused around status effects, which are actually really strong in this game. And not all status effects are created equal, and we'll talk about that in a second. But by wearing this set, the Liberationers set, we're going to get increased status effect accumulation, power drop on enemies when we land a fatal strike, increase the duration of negative effects on enemies, damage amp on fatal strike, and increases the damage dealt to enemies that are suffering from negative effects. This is going to lead into the strongest loop in the game, which is dotting enemies, making them take a bunch of dot damage that builds up their spirit, fatal striking them, and then dotting them again. And it can like make fights a lot easier when they're constantly suffering from effects, which will build up their spirit meter, and then you can just go in for easy fatal strikes. It's a really powerful loop. So on our gear, we're going to be focusing for damage against enemies that are suffering from negative effects, lightning attack power, and accumulation on enemies via our status effects. So on our boots, for example, I've got shock accumulation, lightning attack power, spirit damage to enemies with negative effects, and heaviness accumulation on enemies. Here I've got martial arts damage, lightning attack power, shock accumulation, and power gain upon deflecting a critical blow. We've got ranged spirit damage received, damage to enemies with negative effect, shock accumulation on enemies, lightning attack power, and lastly, damage reduction on wizardry spell use, lightning attack power, damage to enemies with negative effects, and shock accumulation on enemies. You get the idea. So the reason we're going to be using 3 status effects on this build. We've got poison, we've got heaviness, and we've got toxic. Now, the reason that we are prioritizing lightning is a few things. 1, lightning damage over time inflicts spirit. 2, we're going to be imbuing our weapon with lightning, so it's going to be directly impacting the damage that we're dealing. And we're going to be scaling our wood the highest. Our metal is going to be second highest, and our stone is going to be the least high. So we want to deal the most damage with lightning, and lightning, when you do a lightning status effect to an enemy, will constantly chip away at their spirit bar, giving you free fatal strikes. So it's really important that we want to make sure that our enemies we're fighting are always affected by lightning. Now, going off of what I just said kind of for our stats, the weapons that I've got on, we have to have the Night Owl's Cane. This is a solid weapon, not the best weapon. It's going to scale off of A in metal. D in water and B or B in water, D for like wood. It's not great. Now, for our main weapon that we're going to want to be using, we have actually a few options. So the first option that I went with is the Saint Virtue's sword. This is going to get A+ scaling in wood, which is exactly what we want, and A- scaling in metal, our two highest stats, and then C- in fire, which we don't really care for. Your other options here are a Ritual Sword of Chaos, which is also really nice and has a really nice moveset with Sword of Chaos and Meteor Shower. I like that a lot. And lastly, you could use a Guiding Blade if you wanted to lose out on some weapon damage, but gain some more in Thunderous Impact, because Thunderous Impact does a bunch of spirit damage. I found this attack to be not useful against a lot of bosses, and this is a bossing build, so that is why we're using the Saint's Virtue Sword. For our spells, you're going to want to be using Elemental Plague. This is going to increase the accumulation of all status effects dealt to enemies for a certain period of time. This just makes it easier to dot enemies. We're going to be pairing that with ways to dot or affect status effects to enemies. So we've got Venomous Discharge. This is super good. It's going to leave a pool of poison on the ground. Poison ticks will actually increase the spirit bar, so enemies that are getting ticked by poison are not only going to get taken damage, they're going to get dotted, so that we're going to deal more damage to them, and also their spirit bar will constantly increase. That stacks with the lightning status effect. Lightning status effect, when we hit enemies with lightning, and we're going to be with the amount of accumulation that we have, I'm literally hitting an enemy with 1 to 2 sword attacks, and they have the lightning dot. Lightning dot will tick even more of their spirit away. You can kind of see where this build is going. We're going to want to be constantly having them dotted, and when they're dotted, they're going to be having their spirit bar filled without us even attacking them. And lastly, we've got Quakebound. Now, this is the flex slot. Everything else, I think, is pretty mandatory. Quakebound gives you the ability, when you deflect, to build up stone accumulation, or aka like heaviness on enemies, which is just another status effect which will make enemies easier for you to deal with. There is a late game set that I have not acquired yet that increases the amount of damage you deal to enemies per unique status effect, and that's what we're going to be transitioning to once I get that set. I just haven't acquired it yet, but that is what I would use with that. Quakebound is nice. We are on light armor. Light armor doesn't have the most amount of defense, so if you're feeling squishy, you can go for the spell Perfect Restoral, which is going to basically negate a hit every time you get hit, and we're spec'd so much into metal that we can actually cast these spells without having to like fully fill up our spirit. We have like 40 points in metal, so casting all these spells and using them actually isn't a burden to our combat, versus on our fire build, you'd cast like 2 spells, and then if you got hit, you'd get put into the like stunned stance. So for most bosses, I'd probably be rocking Lightning Weapon, Venomous Discharge, Perfect Restoral, and Elemental Plague. For our Divine Beast, we're going to be using Tangshi mainly for this stat, the increased spirit damage dealt to enemies afflicted with negative effects. The enemies we're going to be fighting are constantly dotted. Their spirit bars are constantly going to be ticking to make them take critical strikes, and so we want to build that up faster. The spell damage is also very nice and increases our status effect accumulation on enemies. This is kind of perfect for us. If you're feeling squishy and you want like extra health, you can go for the Qing Long, but I don't think you're going to need it, honestly, with this build. I haven't needed it. We're just using more status effect accumulation and outputting as much damage as we can. And lastly, for our stats, we're prioritizing Wood Virtue. Lots of Wood Virtue is great for New Game Plus. We get a ton of HP. Plus, we're focusing lightning damage as kind of our main damage dealer on our weapons. We've got Fire Virtue at 1. I didn't want to focus on martial arts. If you wanted to use that Guiding Blade, and use that more, you could put more points into Fire Virtue. I found that not effective against the harder bosses, so I am not focusing on my martial arts. We're more so focused on our spell casting and hitting enemies a few times to get them instantly into their like crit stance, and then critical striking them and keeping up all those status effects. So I wanted to focus on Metal Virtue because it's going to let us cast more spells more often. We've got 20 into Earth Virtue. Earth Virtue here is the most interchangeable. You could put these 20 points into Fire Virtue if you want to use more martial arts. The reason we're in the Earth Virtue is because of the heaviness accumulation that we've got that we can build up on enemies, which is just another status effect and another way to keep enemies down. 40 Metal Virtue is for our poison damage and also so we can cast more wizardry spells. We're going to want to keep our enemies dotted as much as possible, and in order to keep them dotted, we have to have our spells going at all times. We want 100% uptime on those dots on enemies, so metal works out really well for that. And lastly, 1 into water virtue, because we are not stealthing and none of our weapons scale off of water, or like need the water scaling. So those are our stats. Guys, that is going to do it for the build video. I am such a sucker for status effects and status effect builds in video games, and I'm really happy that there's a viable relying on status effects build in Wo Long. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. If you did, be sure to drop a like, hey, maybe even subscribe, and I'll catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.